Hello, everybody out there in radio land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 WIDR or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may turn out to be. Sorry for getting a slightly late start there, everybody. Again, um, I think this is the winter weather is is kind of longer for me to get in. Also, honestly, I was getting kind of a slow start this morning. I worked out a little too hard yesterday and my 37-year-old muscles are kind of sore. So hopefully we're gonna be joined by at least one or two of my co-hosts in a little bit here. If you're just coming back, we did one episode as a year and wrap up. This kind of going back to our normal format. We're going to be talking about what's been going on here in the city of Kalamazoo, the state of Michigan, the so-called United States, and the rest of the world from a working class perspective, and generally calling out the establishment capitalist media on its BS. Um, so this is going to be an interesting week. This is the last week of the Biden administration. Next week, we're probably going to do a retrospective on the last four years, as is kind of a tradition on the show, kind of like our exit interview, so to speak. And we're also going to be talking on the show today about a number of topics. We're going to be starting in Michigan. We're going to be spending a ton of time talking about local issues today, but we are going to be spending a lot of time talking about the California wildfires. We're going to discuss some of the recent changes on Facebook and kind of their implications. But I thought we would start, especially kind of waiting for my co-host to come down. Bridge, Michigan just did a kind of a duo of articles about climate change here in the state of Michigan that I thought was particularly pertinent. Again, a lot of the climate conversation in the last couple of weeks has been about California and the way that the unprecedented drought has really fueled these fires being carried by the quite vicious Santa Ana winds themselves, exacerbated by changing weather patterns. But it does also hit us here in Michigan, and I know it looking outside right now on a very snowy 18-degree day. This next article might seem a little odd, but in the aggregate, on the average, especially if you remember back to last winter, which eerily did not seem like winter at all, save for a couple of random snowstorms. The overall trajectory of where Michigan is heading in the climate crisis means less snow overall, and also the kind of volatility of the climate is going to be hazardous for a lot of area farmers. We're going to be talking about that as well. So, this article, I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from it. It's published on January 9th by Kelly House. Study climate change means fewer freezing winter days in Michigan. Tough as it may be to believe, as a January chill grips the state, Michigan has lost more than a week annually of freezing weather to climate change. That's the conclusion of a new report from the climate communication nonprofit Climate Central, which found that Michigan is getting 9 fewer days annually of sub 32-degree temperatures today than it would if humans had not altered the Earth's climate by using fossil fuels. The U.S. average is 6 fewer sub-freezing days annually, putting Michigan's 9-day loss on the higher side. The severity of the human cost thaw varies across the state, with Leelanau County experiencing the biggest impact. In the shoreline county north of Traverse City, winter now includes 2 full weeks of days in which temperatures fail to dip below freezing. Iron County has seen the slightest loss, with just 2 fewer freezing days. Those numbers reflect a statewide pattern. In general, the study found that the UP and inland northern Michigan have seen the smallest loss of wintry days due to climate change, while the lower peninsula shorelines have seen the biggest. Though warned not to misconstrue the UP's enduring chill as a sign that it is warming slower than the rest of Michigan. It is just a colder part of the state to begin with, she said, so the warming isn't regularly crossing the freeze thaw line. As for the more pronounced thaw along the coast, blame the moderating influence of water, Dahl said. The Great Lakes are slow to cool down after summer ends. That's why Lake Michigan's surface water temperature is 40 degrees today, even while daytime highs across the state hover in the 20s. That heat emanates off the water, making coastal winters milder than inland winters. Now, climate change is not only warming the air, but also superheating the water to exacerbate the effect. Michigan's warming winters have implications for everything from outdoor recreation to agriculture and mental health. To name just a few of the consequences, fewer freezing days means thinner snow and ice, a disappointment for winter sports enthusiasts and the businesses built around Michigan's penchant for skiing, snowmobiling, and ice fishing. When the Great Lakes fail to freeze over, Michigan gets more lake effect cloud cover caused by icy winds sweeping over the water and picking up moisture, which means more cloudy days as we go through the winter months. A lack of snow can be life threatening for animals that evolve to thrive in harsh winters. That includes the snowshoe hare, whose white winter coat turns from an effective camouflage to a liability when snow melts prematurely. And also, a lack of so called chilling hours poses challenges for Michigan's cherry, apple, and peach farmers. I'm going to kind of pivot now to talk a little bit about there was an article last year um, talking about how the excuse me, the warmer seasonal average temperatures um, can really affect the crop yields in these industries. Um, this they are in this interview. They're talking to Jack King, Vice President of Crop Protection at King Orchards Farms in Central Lake. I'm not in crisis mode, and I'm not so disappointed or anything like that. But I am a little anxious that it's going to be a warmer end of the winter that I would really like. Every hour you get above 50 degrees is another notch towards bloom and coming out of hibernation. And of course, if they come out of hibernation prematurely, that can damage the crop, which means farmers have increased operational costs, and so do other businesses that rely on the crops. We're trying to get into having cherries put into granola bars and cereals and all kinds of delicious things. When you have a year that there aren't any, it really hurts the consistency of being able to make those sales. Going back to the other article really quick, just to kind of pick up where we left off. So far, the winter of 2025 has been relatively mild in Michigan. Surface water temperatures in all five Great Lakes are well above average, and ice coverage is below average. And while parts of the state have received large quantities of lake effect snow, much of it has melted, leaving remaining snow cover below historical averages. A day can make a lot of difference. With temperatures expected to remain below freezing the coming days, Michigan's ice and snow cover could both rebound. Again, if you want to read more about that, you can go to Bridge, Michigan, and their website. Study Climate Change Means Fewer Freezing Winter Days in Michigan. That's published by Kelly House. We're going to take a quick little break. We come back. We're going to kind of pivot topics and talk about some of the things going on at the national level. Keep dialogue. This is Media Cyphers, your source for political revolution. Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So we're going to pivot now to a national issue that I think, again, it's this is a lot of what we were talking about on the show last year. This kind of bipartisan turn as far as xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric, which again does not match up with empirical reality. And this is kind of when we allow the like this misinformation to grow like this. This is some of the turd blossoms that end up blooming, and it's this anti-immigrant Lake and Riley Act I'm about to talk about. It's article from Left Voice by Samuel Carlin goes on to describe it. But again, it really is the drawing out some of our observations last year about how the Democrats really just threw immigrants under the bus and allowed for this not necessarily consensus, but there are significant numbers of Americans who buy into this idea that, again, immigrants are coming across the border and committing crimes in mass. As we've discussed on the show before, um, per capita, immigrants commit less crimes than U.S. citizens. And as we've also mentioned on the show, they pay more into the system than they take out, etc. Um, but this really does lean into that duplicitous narrative, that law and order narrative that, like, the violent hordes are coming across the border. Oh my God. And this is going to have really bad effects on average everyday people who are just trying to get by. So this article is called 48 Democrats Vote for a Racist Law to Detain More Immigrants and Empower the Right. The passage of the Anti-Immigrant Laken Riley Act shows what the right's anti-immigrant agenda will look like and how Democrats will aid these attacks. It was published on January 8th. Congress is back in session just weeks before Donald Trump is set to return to the presidency. Unsurprisingly, an emboldened far-right Republican Party is fast-tracking legislation that the incoming administration can use to carry out its promised mass deportations. In a vote of 264 to 159, the House passed the Laken Riley Act. The bill requires the Department of Homeland Security to detain any undocumented immigrants that are arrested for a range of petty, nonviolent crimes. And here's really the most significant thing in this act. They don't even need to be charged or convicted. An arrest is enough to mandate their detention, upending their lives. This gives more power to any cop that wants to participate in Trump's mass deportation and increases the likelihood of racial profiling and stricter policing of any community deemed as other due to their race or national origin. The bill also allows for attorneys general of any state to sue the federal government if they believe that federal policies are not sufficiently enforcing immigration law or addressing the quote unquote harm that immigrants may be causing to individual states. And again, harm is in scare quotes, emphasis on scare, because again, a lot of the anti immigrant posturing from these attorney generals and governors is based on falsehoods, misinformation. As we cited at the top of the program, again, this proportionally immigrants commit less crimes than U.S. born citizens. I will, I will just hit that on the head as many times as I can, because again, in the last election year, you had both Republicans and Democrats ignoring that reality, that fact, in order to engage in, like, who can out xenophobe the other, who can be a more, I guess, really the Democrats were running on being a more stable adult oppressor of immigrants. So, in any case, I'll go on with the article. The empowerment of state governments to set their own detention and deportation policies and directly challenge those of the federal government has become a pillar of the far right's attack on immigrants since Texas launched its Operation Lone Star. Every single Republican congressperson voted to pass the Laken Riley Act. Importantly, they were joined by 48 Democrats, a significant increase from 37 Democratic votes the last time the bill was up for a vote. This shows that the war on immigration is not only bipartisan, but that the Democratic Party is steadily moving to the right on this issue. The Senate will vote on the bill on January 10th. It is unclear if it will pass there, given that it will need 60 votes, meaning the Republicans will need to convince 8 more Democrats to join them. To rally support for the bill, Republicans have been using appeals to quote unquote law and order, saying that it is common sense to oppose immigrants who commit crimes. This is racist fear-mongering designed to pit sectors of the working class against each other. Even within immigrant communities and certain immigrant rights spaces, some people think that the expanding war on immigrants is okay as long as it only goes after criminals. But the anti-immigrant politicians decide what is considered crime. While they argue that anyone arrested for petty theft, whether or not that person actually committed theft, should be enough to ruin a person's life, these same politicians support big businesses stealing the wages of workers, particularly those who are undocumented. And really think through the implications of that. It will empower police to just profile and arrest and deport whoever they want, because again, it's like, we suspect you of committing a robbery. Okay, you didn't commit the robbery, but you're still going to get arrested and deported under this act. Anyway, excuse me. As and the article goes on to say, um, the most violent crimes are committed by those very same politicians who are voting on this bill, from economic warfare and coups, which have forced many immigrants to flee the United States in the first place, to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which has been made possible by the same politicians who are waging attacks on immigrant workers in the United States. The Laken Riley Act is a first taste of the types of policies and framing the incoming administration will use to attack immigration. The fact that this is one of the first moves Congress is advancing in its new session shows how serious the right is about waging these attacks. Immigrant rights activists, workers, and the left must get serious by developing organizations that mobilize against these attacks. Expose the hypocrisy of politicians who claim to care about safety as a way to divide workers in the United States, and articulate a radical program to unite immigrant workers and U.S. born workers alike against the far right. So that was Samuel Carlin with Left Voice. Headline of the article: 48 Democrats vote for a racist law to detain more immigrants and empower the right. We're going to take another quick little break. We're going to pivot topics again when we come back. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WITR or online at widerfm.org, your source for political revolution. And keep in mind, you can also find us online. Media Cyphers is on Facebook, for the time being anyway. And we are also on YouTube. And you can find our podcast on most streaming apps. Listen to Media Cyphers on the go, at your leisure, at your convenience. We will be right back. Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WITR or online at widerfm.org. So the next thing I think we're going to talk about, I want to dive into what's been going on with Facebook over the course of this week. So, for those of you who haven't heard, Mark Zuckerberg appeared in a video looking honestly like not unlike some like mid 2000s MySpace guy. Ironically, like, just like the gold chain and the hair and stuff. Anyway, but he should popped up and say, "Hey, everybody, um, so we're going to get rid of fact checkers. Not only that, but in the fine print, it's basically they're basically making it permissible to harass LGBTQ people, women, um, similar guardrails um, for quote unquote free speech." Are basically targeting the picadillos of a kind of far right conservative movement. So it's ostensibly not necessarily just like, oh, carte blanche free speech. It's making it more permissible, at least on the platform, for members to engage in bigotry against particular marginalized groups. Um, Now, I think this is a really brilliant example of kind of, a lot of the historical trends that we talk about on our show coming home to roost. Which is to say, think back 8 years ago, you had corporations like Meta and the rest, kind of in a state of confusion. There's been kind of this faux liberal orthodoxy in our culture for a while, which is to say, again, most Americans are fairly socially progressive. when it comes to issues of like, queer folks, race, etc. Um, the anti-DI nonsense is kind of representative of not only very vocal minority of the population, but it's typically is again been used as a red herring to again enrage people. Again, blame the other, etc. This is all like well stayed classic fascist tactics. What you've seen in Trump's victory in 2020 as opposed to 2016 is, or no, 2024, sorry, is kind of a shedding of that liberal orthodoxy. It's these corporations who spoiler alert, these corporations didn't have any moral backbone to begin with. It all comes down to money. And here's what it comes down to is corporations like Facebook and all the rest behaved in a socially progressive manner because they realized most of their base were socially progressive. So again, they would celebrate Pride Month. They would, Black Lives Matter. We all remember the ridiculousness in 2020 of like corporations like Nike trying to capitalize off the uprisings. Um, Now, what has happened now is we have a unique situation where a president is coming in who his motley crew, his coalition, the chunks of the electorate he got to vote for him and give him money. He's basically made promises to use the power of the state to attack quoted wokeism, or as I like to call it, knowing stuff and having empathy. It's an attack on not being an idiot. Is basically what it is, and what we're seeing is these very same capitalists who made slightly different calculations in 2016 and 2020 making a different calculation, which is to say, hey, if we do not toe the line to these like new age segregationists, we could lose some money because the government, Trump is basically and his 2025 buddies have basically vowed to use the power of the states to try to go after companies for being just the bare minimum socially liberal. It's like just basically the buck is allow bigotry and misinformation on your platforms, or else it's going to financially hurt you. So we see the pivot of Mark Zuckerberg from like just generic NPC liberal to oh yeah I'm a conservative. This company isn't masculine enough. I'm going to go on Joe Rogan. Um, Now, a little bit too much has been focused on Mark Zuckerberg as an individual. I mean, is he a misogynist? Well, Facebook started as like a website to rate how hot his female classmates were. So, what does that tell you? But I think what's more instructive is to understand 8 years ago, we had a more kind of a liberal capitalist culture that was more interested in following the money to the culture. We now have a situation where, and again, it's interesting. Mark Zuckerberg has framed this as a cultural shift. The culture is shifting rightward, which is not at all the case. The culture itself, again, is and we could go in a much broader discussion about the failures of the left to capitalize on the decline of neoliberalism. But no, what we're seeing is there has not been a lurch to the right. There has been an entrenchment of these kind of right-wing culture warriors in positions of power. So that the calculus that the capitalists are running is to go along with that program um, for the time being. Again, we could see something in the next few months, and maybe Zuckerberg will run the numbers, and he'll come back out with his pride and trans pride flags. But for the time being, the capitalists are very much going along with this. Jeff Bezos has bent the knee. He recently, well, not him personally, but maybe they banned a cartoon from the Washington Post that just showed a bunch of billionaires kissing Trump's feet. I think, though, it is a little reductive, again, to just read it as they are bending the knee to Donald Trump. It's more they are bending the knee to, and again, this is the calculus of capitalism, to market forces. They are bending the knee to an administration that will be financially hostile to them if they do not have a socially reactionary agenda. And it also just goes to show these corporations have no morality on their own. Their only moral is the financial bottom line. So, in a time of the kind of fascist upheaval we are dealing with, they are very much just towing the line of the ascendant fascists who are going to be in power in about a week here. So, with all that being said, what exactly is the new policy at Facebook? It basically allows for that kind of just discrimination and bigotry. It is okay to refer to queer people as mentally ill. It is okay now to refer to women as objects. They were replacing um, they were content moderation or not. They were replacing fact checkers with community notes. Um, and I wanted to kind of hit some excerpts from a couple of articles that I think they draw on some dimensions of this issue that I don't think the mainstream media necessarily is. So I wanted to start. This is from Mike Ludwig at Truthout. Meta's allowance of hate speech is another side effect of big tech monopoly. The latest free speech proclamation from a big tech billionaire has caused both alarm and a collective eye roll. Digital rights activists, excuse me, say the debate over freedom of speech and content moderation has devolved into a partisan food fight without challenging the virtual monopolies that few wealthy companies hold over our data and online experience. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg's announcement on January 8th that Instagram and Facebook will remove third party fact checking teams and replace them with community notes, similar to the artist formerly known as Twitter. Users can flag posts for misinformation and clarifying comments, crowdsource, etc. Zuckerberg's announcement was quickly pegged by critics as a political move meant to appease Donald Trump, his incoming administration, and its very online fan base. Despite Trump's narrow electoral victory, Zuckerberg is only the latest billionaire mogul to show an unprecedented level of fealty to the incoming president. As reporters at Axios put it, Trump is entering office with ever expansive power as a result. Multiple major tech firms have made large donations to Trump's inauguration fund, with Google, Microsoft, and Meta and OpenAI pledging $1 million each. I don't think you can be a content moderation expert to be able to look at this and see that Mark Zuckerberg is bending the knee to Trump, said Evan Greer, director of the digital rights group Fight for the Future, in an interview. This is frankly what human rights experts have been concerned about for years, when we sort of play this game of working the referees in a game that the public always loses. In his announcement, Zuckerberg promised more speech and fewer mistakes on his massive platforms, but admitted that content moderators could now catch less bad stuff. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, a nonprofit organization that promotes freedom of speech and digital rights, initially put a cautiously optimistic blog post in response to Zuckerberg's move. Meta has in the past controversially blocked content that passes muster according to its own guidelines. Just this week, it was reported that Facebook wrongly censored LGBTQ content, and EFF supports good faith efforts to fix the problems. The group said Meta should focus on commonly censored but legitimate content posted by sex worker organizers or political dissidents outside the United States, for example. These are not us issues, these are global issues, said David Green, EFF's Civil Liberties Director and co author of the blog post, in an interview. A lot of mistakes are made with political dissident speech in other countries, so these are just some issues that are problematic all around the world. However, the EFF cautioned that Meta's decision to move content moderation teams from California to Texas in order to combat bias is clearly more political than practical and raises big questions about Zuckerberg's intentions. It's just stupid. It's the most obvious political thing. If anything, what they've done is traded perceived California bias for perceived Texas bias. Zuckerberg's announcement was part of a busy week for Meta's public relations amid concerns, including from its own staff, about recent company changes. Facebook was caught censoring employees on a company forum who were posting jokes and complaints about the decision to add United Fighting Championship CEO Dana White to Meta's board of directors. White campaigned for Trump, and Facebook employees pointed to a 2022 video of White slapping his wife in a nightclub. The posts were taken down for violating community standards, according to tech recorders at 404 Media. Despite Zuckerberg's free speech rhetoric, 404 Media also says its stories about censorship on Facebook are censored on the platform. Musk is also notorious for espousing free speech on Twitter. Then news broke, revealing that Meta was also quietly relaxing hate speech standards, with The Independent in Britain reporting that Facebook and Instagram users are now allowed to call women property and protected groups like transgender people freaks on those platforms. According to Meta, dehumanizing or insulting posts that could previously be flagged and removed are now allowed in the context of political debate over transgender rights, immigration, or homosexuality. LGBTQ groups have denounced Zuckerberg and warned of widespread harassment and violence. The EFF called the changes concerning as researchers rushed to analyze the new policy. The EFF issued a new statement on Thursday saying it was a mistake to formulate our responses and expectations on what is essentially a marketing video for upcoming policy changes before any of those changes were reflected in their documentation. Instead of taking a closer look at marginalized voices that had been unfairly censored, Meta took the opposite tack, making targeted changes that would allow dehumanizing statements to be made about certain vulnerable groups. There wasn't a need to sort of refine their hate speech policy. It does lend a lot of support to the idea that this is more of a primarily political capitulation than it was an earnest attempt to revise pressing problems with content moderation. Democrats and liberals responded with outrage to Zuckerberg's apparent appeasement of conservatives, who have attacked social media companies for years with debunked claims that moderators combating misinformation, hate speech, and harassment are biased against them. However, some activists say Facebook was not doing a great job at protecting users and marginalized voices to begin with. They also argue that social media CEOs have proven to be politically malleable, adjusting their content moderation policies based on which U.S. party is in power and prioritizing profits over protecting users. Greer said that the intensely partisan nature of the debate over content moderation obscures the bigger problem. As long as we have these big tech companies that dominate so much of our information space, they are always going to kowtow to governments, whether the US or others, in ways that impact people's expression. What bums me out is that it feels like people are sort of happy to go along with that when the party they support is in power, and only get concerned about it when the party they don't support is in power. Greer worries that too much time and effort from digital activists is spent fighting over content moderation policies, while true freedom of speech will remain elusive as long as a tiny handful of surveillance platforms run by self interested capitalists have a stranglehold on the online spaces where we hold important discussions. Liberals typically say they want more moderation from private companies, while conservatives generally want less. But Greer says this seemingly endless debate misses the point. Instead of trying to work the referees, Greer says, it would be better to demand lawmakers address structural issues, including privacy legislation that would limit the monopolies on surveillance technology and personal data collection, and that have allowed social media companies to grow so big and destructive in the first place. Big tech thrives off of sucking up and selling our personal data, and social media giants can simply copy innovations made by competitors and kill them off with sheer control over the market. And I'm just going to go down towards the end of this article here. People are remembering that social media is kind of us when it's not woefully distorted and stultified in the interests of monopolists and capitalists, and we can have alternatives. That article was from Truth Out, headline Meta's allowance of hate speech is another side effect of big tech monopoly. Um, I'm going to also cite some things from Democracy Now! And their article about Mark Zuckerberg, but something that has come to mind, and I know there's been some debate among leftists about whether to abandon Facebook entirely as a platform after these changes. Um, here's kind of my 2 cents on it. And honestly, like I was a little bit more on the side of like, I mean, I think we all need to disengage a bit from social media. The best social media is again going out in your community on Friday or Saturday night, talking to people at a show or a party or a concert or just community events, outdoor. well, probably not any outdoor picnics right now, but you get my feeling. But whether we like it or not, platforms like X and Facebook, they are basically the 21st century public square. And something important to think about as far as like what does it mean to like cede territory to quote unquote the right. And again, there are alternatives that are popping up. Blue Sky, Red Note, etc. Are gaining some traction. But for the time being, Facebook, and in particular, I have more experience in Facebook than X. Um, it is probably the most inherently social of the social platforms. Again, people go on there to share their life experiences with people. Um, there's kind of a back catalog, your photo albums, your memories, etc. And also the way that Facebook fosters groups and those sorts of discussions. And I would say like maybe the bigger thing to worry about is, uh, kind of the other side of that coin, where Facebook is going to be facing a lot of pressure, and the other social media companies to more overtly oppress left wing spaces and groups on their platform. But for now, I think it is important to give, especially marginalized folks, space to back away from social media. Again, for all my trans brothers and sisters out there, immigrants and stuff, it's not healthy to go on a platform where you're going to constantly be dogpiled and bullied on there. I will say for those people who are maybe more psychologically equipped to deal with that harassment, or particularly, you know, if you're from a position as like a cis white guy who left politics, stay on. My recommendation: stay on Facebook and be a pain in the butt to everybody else who wants to be a bigot. So, um, I also didn't want to cite there's an important kernel to this story too, um, relating to misinformation and something that kind of gets left out of these domestic discussions is the way that misinformation on Facebook has really allowed for some atrocities to occur. The genocide in Myanmar was shown to be have some really direct links to the upsurge in discrimination and misinformation online in that country. And we had a company, Facebook, that was really completely disinterested in doing any sort of content moderation. The Philippines is also a really important case study on how social media misinformation can swing entire countries. Um, and I wanted to talk about I'm going to directly quote one of the folks they're interviewing on here. Excuse me, about what happened in the Philippines. Um, so basically, excuse me, what happened, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the specific chunk of the article where they're talking about it, but in the Philippines, they had an election in the last couple of years um, where, excuse me, where basically history was rewritten for one of the candidates. So this is Maria Ressa, who is from the Philippines. Excuse me. CEO and executive editor of the Philippine independent news site Rappler. So they went on to say, in the Philippines, we had a bout with our own dictator starting in 2016, and I would say we were in hell under our previous president, and now we're in purgatory while the United States is just headed to hell, it feels like. Let me quickly say it's not a free speech issue, which is what Zuckerberg claims. It's a safety issue. And exactly what we just heard, what you're seeing is now this platform, one that unites more than 3.2 billion people around the world, has declared open season on minorities. Actually, it's no longer safe for any person because one of the things we've learned in the Philippines is that the insidious manipulation on this takes away will, right? So we already know around the world that it has become a platform that has enabled genocide. This is in Myanmar and Southeast Asia. Meta itself sent a team, and they concurred with the United States in two separate findings. Second one is this is a platform that has hacked our biology that changes the way we feel fear, anger, and hate to change the way we see the world and the way we act. Election interference. What you've seen now, as early as 2016 on Brexit, the UK actually fined Facebook then the largest amount at the point of the time because of what would be equivalent to election interference. And going on to speak more about the Philippines, our past president, Rodrigo Duterte, used the design of what was an advertising and marketing platform on Facebook to do information operations. I was getting an average of 90 hate messages per hour, which is free speech used to stifle free speech. But beyond that, these networks of information warfare, networks of disinformation, literally changed our history in front of our eyes, setting the stage for the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the only son of our dictator who was in power for 21 years. Ferdinand Marcos. You remember Imelda Marcos and her shoes. Her son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., won overwhelmingly in our presidential elections because literally Filipinos were taught in information operations, that's YouTube, Meta, and Facebook, that Marcos was not a dictator in 1986, ousted in people power. Instead, he was the greatest leader the Philippines has ever known. So, again, just wrapping up that discussion on Facebook is again like this, especially these guardrails are just going to allow for more of that misinformation to flourish, that historical revisionism. And I think we should all be alarmed about that. And, again, it is my hope that we find alternatives in the coming years that are not controlled by monopoly capitalists. But for the time being, I guess I'm going to be sticking around on Facebook, calling out the BS, and really just being a pain in the butts for capitalists and fascists. Keep dialogue. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find us online at Facebook, YouTube. Yeah, we were just talking about it. We're still on Facebook, YouTube, and the Media Cyphers podcast you can find on most podcasting apps. Keep it dialogue. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR, your source for political revolution. Hello again, everybody out there in radio land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. So, coming up, we're going to talk about the wildfires in California. There's a lot to cover on this particular issue. There's a lot of dimensions to it. There are a couple I did want to hit on, which we're going to be looking a bit at an article about how some of the funding was allocated, but just some interesting observations about how the media has covered this. There have been some allusions to climate change in some of the legacy media. Again, not really nearly enough. There's not enough discussion about how this unprecedented drought created the conditions for this firestorm, nor was there any real discussion about the fact that like January is not typical. It is not. Yes, I think a lot. It's the rapid normalization of these disasters is really doing a number on a country that historically has always had really bad historical memory. I mean, look who's about to be president in a week, and yeah, that's the Americans have the political memory of a goldfish. That's not necessarily their fault. That is again the result of again a media ecosystem that does not want us to really reflect or digest events as we see them and as we experience them. But again, this kind of tossing every disaster down the memory hole, these kind of once in 100-year storms, that's just normal now. So I think people have become kind of desensitized when we see big weather events like this that 20 years ago would have that would have been a Bruckheimer film or like Deep Impact or The Day After Tomorrow or something like that. It's also the first time again we've seen these wildfires in California again just the last 10 years. There's always a story about these terrible wildfires in the summer, but what was really different this time is it really came much closer to home, much closer to central Los Angeles than these wildfires ever have. And it's been a warning of the destructive power of nature when it's been supercharged by climate change and its capacity to cripple or wipe out a densely populated city. In a lot of ways, we got very lucky right now, but the Santa Ana winds have been blowing in a different direction. We could have seen much more massive. It's already been the largest and most destructive wildfire in the history of LA, and it could have been much, much worse. I'm watching this from the edge of my seat, not only as somebody who pays attention to the current events, but I have family out in LA who at one point were like 10 miles away from the closest fire. Um, and it's been kind of disgraceful. You watch the legacy media kind of skirt around climate change, the right-wing media going completely bonkers, blaming wildfires on DEI. Like, um, and again, like kind of one of the funnier things that happened is like I've been blaming DEI for the female fire chief, who's like, well, but the moment she stood up to the Democrat mayor and Gavin Newsom, she's become a darling of the right again. No real like ideological principles, just like it's the way that the right wing has tried to also minimize climate change in their own way by pointing to it's sometimes a little bit more effective when you point to some elements of truth. Like, yes, there are elements of mismanagement that went into this, but again, that does not mean climate change was not a compounding factor in what we have seen unfold in LA. And again, it kind of ties into what we're talking about earlier. Just like again, the um, proliferation of misinformation that is leading people to doubt the evidence of their eyes and ears when it comes to events like this. Um, and again, they've also tried to blame homeless people. And like, again, there was somebody on Fox News who tried, without any evidence, that it was like a homeless person who like threw their cigarette butt or something, rather than again the continual mismanagement of the billionaire class. There's two billionaires in the state of California that hoard a disproportionate amount of the state's fresh water reserves, which are needed to fight these fires. Again, they are hoarding billions of gallons of water to harvest. What is it? Not cashew nuts, but um, pistachios while the hydrants are running dry in LA. So again, heart goes out to everybody affected by these fires. Again, I had some people in my family who were but let's call out the BS, which is these wildfires are the result of decades and decades of misinformation from fossil fuel corporations trying to minimize the climate crisis, and this is the climate crisis coming home to roost. Um, I did also want to talk a little bit about some mismanagement on the budgetary level. This comes to us from The Intercept article by Schuler Mitchell. LA budgeted money for cop jobs while cutting fire department positions. Now the city is burning. It's published on January 8th. Less than 12 hours after a massive fire began ripping through the Pacific Palisades on Tuesday, the Los Angeles Fire Department made a rare request. All LAFD firefighters, including those off duty, were asked to phone in their availability. Stoked by high winds, the blaze was growing quickly and the LAFD was already fighting a losing battle. Such a summons hasn't been made in nearly 2 decades. As of January 8th, the Palisades fire was 0% contained. Two additional wildfires, the Hearst fire and the Eden fire, were also currently at zero uh, containment as they scorched greater Los Angeles County, burning thousands of acres, destroying over 1,100 structures, and killing at least 5 people. All of those totals have increased since then. As hundreds of firefighters raced to stop the spread, gusting Santa Ana winds and a landscape desiccated by a bone dry winter and anomaly linked to broader climate change trends, those aren't the only obstacles the LAFD was facing. In June, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass signed and adopted $12.8 billion budget that cut the fire department's funding by more than $17.5 million, or around 2% of the previous year's budget of $837 million. It was the second largest departmental operating cut to come out of the city's 2024 through 25 fiscal year budget, which shaved funding from the majority of city departments, but not the police. The Los Angeles Police Department received a funding bump of nearly $126 million. The mayor's initial budget proposal included a $23 million decrease for the fire department, a more drastic reduction than what the LA City Council finally approved. The outdated $23 million figure circulated widely on social media after the wildfires this week. The fire department operating budget is about a third of what the LAPD is allocated. What is currently happening and unfolding is what we have been warning about, said Ricky Sergienko, a lawyer and organizer with People's City Council LA. The consistent defunding of other city programs in order to give the LAPD billions a year has consequences, and these elected officials do actually have blood on their hands. The city is unprepared to handle this fire, and Los Angeles shouldn't be in that position. Other departments that received major cuts include the Bureau of Street Services, the Bureau of Sanitation, and General Services for an overall budget increase of nearly $250 million. Funds for rental support, homeless services, and street lighting were also reduced. Only three city council members, Hugo Soto Martinez, Natia Roman, and Eunices Hernandez, voted against the budget last May, noting in a press release that it allocated tens of millions of dollars to fund LAPD positions that would likely remain vacant. That's because the LAPD has struggled to recruit officers in recent years, even as it continues to request and receive funding for those empty positions. Since The Intercept and local news outlets reported that the fiscal year LA fire budget declined by $17.6 million, elected officials have pushed back. LA City Council member Bob Blumenfield disputed the budget cuts, telling Politico that the fire department in fact received a $50 million increase in funding this year. The new funds he referenced appear to come from an agreement reached within the firefighters union in November for raises and benefits, but are not linked to increased staffing. Those funds have not yet been distributed, according to City Controller Kenneth Maya. A spokesperson for Maya said that the LAFD budget cuts last June included a reduction in sworn payroll, reduced funds for operating supplies, and an elimination of 58 positions. In December, weeks after the new union contract was signed, the Board of Fire Commissioners sent a report to Bass and the City Council outlining how the funding cuts in the budget had adversely impacted the department's crucial services. An LAPD spokesperson reached by The Intercept said that they could not respond to questions by the time of publication. While it's unclear that any amount of staffing could have fully contained the fires raging across Los Angeles last week, the call for help and the firefighters traveling in to assist from across California and nearby states show that any additional capacity in place before the fire sparked could have helped. The controversial cuts were ostensibly made to help close the city's budget deficits. Critics, however, have noted that defunding the fire department is a recipe for disaster as the climate crisis brings increasingly devastating fires to the drought-stricken region. The Los Angeles City Fire Department is facing unprecedented operational challenges due to the elimination of critical civilian positions and a $7 million reduction in overtime variable staffing hours, wrote Fire Chief Kristen Crowley wrote in the December Board of Fire Commissioners report to city officials. These budgetary reductions have adversely affected the department's ability to maintain core operations, such as technology and communication infrastructure, payroll processing, training, fire prevention, and community education. The LFD's Fire Prevention Bureau, for instance, had 6 of its roles cut and its overtime hours reduced. Crowley wrote that the decrease in overtime hours created an inability to complete required brush clearance inspections, which are crucial for mitigating fire risks in high hazard areas. While most departments received cuts, LAPD's budget continues to bloat, and Maya has pointed out to overspending on police liability claims as one major source of the city's deficit. The city spent more than double its annual liability payouts budget in the first 6 months of this fiscal year, with the LAPD leading the spending at more than $100 million in legal settlements. Recent payouts include $17.7 million settlement with the family of a mentally disabled man who was fatally shot by an off-duty officer inside a Costco. and an $11.8 million payout to a man who has sustained a traumatic brain injury in a car accident when an LAPD detective ran a red light. Diana Shang, Maya's communications director, highlighted two forces that are driving a rise in liability payouts, most of which are made from the city's general fund rather than department specific appropriations. Departments are either not held accountable for liabilities they give rise to, Chang wrote, or they are underfunded / understaffed and cannot keep up with the necessary demands and needs of the city. Sergienko of People's City Council LA bristled at the use of taxpayer money to fund police abuse settlements. We're paying for state sanctioned violence instead of having to deal with the climate crisis. We just give more money to the police, who then end up costing us more money due to all of these settlements. It's a never ending loop. Looking ahead, the LAPD has already requested another increase for the 25 through 26 fiscal year. In November, the LA Board of Police Commissioners approved a spending package that included a request for an additional $160.5 million from the city's budget, an increase of more than 8%. Bass is currently reviewing the proposal. She's expected to unveil the city's next budget plan in late April. Bass's office, which did not immediately respond to a request for comment, has publicly clashed with Maya over his criticism of the city budget. Last spring, after Maya called the deductions to public services short-sighted, Bass spokesperson Zach Seidel dismissed the remarks as theatrical exaggeration and doomsday projections. For many Angelenos, that doomsday is now here. The fires burning across the county are already the most destructive in modern LA history, forcing more than 80,000 evacuations with no signs of abating. Whole blocks in the Palisades are leveled. The Eaton fire is eating its way through Altadena, Pasadena, and the surrounding communities, taking at least 5 lives so far. Los Angeles is no stranger to wildfires, but a January disaster is unusual. Studies show that climate change is contributing to longer, more destructive fire seasons. Still, in 2020, LA's then mayor Eric Garcetti cut another $500,000 in funds set aside for a climate emergency mobilization office. The impact of this catastrophic event will be felt by our community well past today, but we hope that our city's coordinated efforts will provide assistance to ensure the smoothest recovery possible, Chang wrote in a statement. As always, we support putting resources and meaningful investment towards saving lives through emergency preparedness, wildfire prevention, and serious climate action, and encourage the city's decision makers to prioritize those resources and investments. That was written by Schuler Mitchell. LA budgeted money for cop jobs while cutting fire department positions. Now the city is burning. We're going to take another quick break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WITR or online at widerfm.org, your source for political revolution. You can also find us online at Facebook, YouTube, and the Media Cyphers podcast, which you can find on most podcasting apps. You can listen to our show at your leisure, tell your friends, all that stuff. In any case, we'll be right back with more Media Cyphers, your source for political revolution. Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WITR or online at widerfm.org. So I think we're going to close today's show. We're going to close a little early, but if you're listening on the radio, we'll be playing back. I'll probably replaying first chunk of our holiday special, because that's kind of our year in review show. Next week, tune in. I'm going to be having my co-host. We're going to kind of do a post-mortem of the Biden presidency. But I wanted to focus on these two articles about kind of, again, censorship and repression of the LGBTQ community. And one is from a corporation and one is from the state. So kind of bookend things like that. But this, we alluded to this earlier. I wanted to kind of dive in into deeper detail about how Meta has been falsely censoring LGBTQ content on their platforms. This is from Taylor Lorenz. It was published on January 6th. Instagram blocked teens from searching LGBTQ related content for months. For months, Meta has been restricting content with LGBTQ related hashtags from search and discovery under its sensitive content policy aimed at restricting sexually suggestive content. Sorry. Yeah. Posts with LGBTQ hashtags, including lesbian, bisexual, gay, trans, queer, non binary, pansexual, trans woman, T girl, T boy, T girls are beautiful, bisexual pride, lesbian pride, and dozens of others were hidden for any users who had their sensitive content filter turned on. Again, and none of those things are inherently sexual, as I think most people could agree. Anyway, when teen users attempted to search LGBTQ terms, they were shown a blank page and a prompt from Meta to review the platform's sensitive content restrictions, which discuss why the app hides sexually explicit content. And I really do want you to think about the context of Mark Zuckerberg coming out, free speech, free speech, free speech. Free speech for whom exactly? So keep in mind, it's free speech for bigots, marginalization for the marginalized. Anyway, Meta reversed the restrictions on LGBTQ search terms after UserMag reached out for the comment, saying that it was an error. These search terms and hashtags are mistakenly restricted, a Meta spokesperson said. It's important to us that all communities feel safe and welcome on Meta apps, and we do not consider LGBTQ plus terms to be sensitive under our policies. Under mounting pressure from lawmakers and amidst a moral panic about young people's social media use last year, Meta introduced a new set of sensitive content restrictions across Instagram, Facebook, and Threads aimed at teenagers. We'll start to hide more types of content for teens on Instagram and Facebook, the company said at the time. In September, Meta doubled down, forcing users under the age of 18 to use Instagram teen accounts, a setting which could only be reversed by a parent or guardian. The goal of this change, in Meta's words, was to limit the content teenagers see and help ensure their time is well spent. These changes quickly resulted in LGBTQ plus content getting restricted across Meta apps. Meanwhile, heterosexual content, tradwife content, and content featuring straight cisgender couples, even those engaged in romantic activities, has flourished. Meta categorizing LGBTQ hashtags as sensitive content is an alarming example of censorship that should concern everyone, said Leanna Garfield, social media safety program manager at GLAAD. Some LGBTQ teenagers and content creators attempted to sound the alarm about the issues, but their posts failed to gain traction. For years, LGBTQ creators on Instagram had suffered shadow bans and had their content labeled as non recommendable. The restrictions on searches, however, are more recent, coming into effect in the past few months. Meta said it was investigating to find out when the error began. A responsible and inclusive company would not build an algorithm that classifies some LGBTQ hashtags as sensitive content, hiding helpful and age appropriate content from young people by default. Regardless of if this was an unintended error, Meta should test significant product updates before launch. Several LGBTQ teenagers the journalist spoke to said they weren't even aware of the sensitive content restrictions, but said they had struggled to find other LGBTQ young people to connect with through Instagram. For many LGBTQ people, especially youth, platforms like Instagram are crucial for self discovery, community building, and accessing supportive information, Garfield said. By limiting access to LGBTQ content, Instagram may be inadvertently contributing to the isolation and marginalization of LGBTQ users. The downranking and hiding of LGBTQ content comes as LGBTQ rights across the country are under attack. On December 4th, the Supreme Court heard a major case on banning healthcare for trans youth. Trump has pledged to roll back protections for LGBTQ students, and right wing groups like the Heritage Foundation are working together with Democrats to dismantle civil liberties and restrict young people from accessing social media under dangerous proposed legislation such as the very poorly named Kids Online Safety Act. COSA co-sponsor Representative Marsha Blackburn claimed that it's essential to restrict teens' access to social media to protect minor children from the transgender in this culture and that influence. So again, people directly look at people's identities as a threat. So one of the most prominent voices pushing legislation like COSA and boosting policies like Meta's sensitive content restrictions in NY Stern School of Business professor Jonathan Haidt, whose dubious book, The Anxious Generation, falsely ties social media use to teen mental health issues in order to push a moral panic about kids and technology use. This moral panic is then used to justify harmful laws that restrict speech and civil liberties online and do immense harm to marginalized LGBTQ youth. In an interview he did with PBS, Haidt boosted a false fringe conspiracy about trans youth known as social contagion or rapid onset gender dysphoria theory. Basically, Instagram is turning your kids gay and trans. In December, Barack Obama recommended the book at the top of his annual reading list. Mark Zuckerberg recently dined at Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Florida and is seeking an active role in Trump tech policy as the two are now warming to each other, according to The Guardian. The increased censorship of LGBTQ content online is already having devastating effects on young people. For queer teens who rely on social media to connect with their peers and find support, these policies are cutting off vital access to community and representation. Meta should not only stop suppressing LGBTQ content in this way, it should also clarify how and why this error occurred, said Garfield. So that article, that was from Taylor Lorenz, published on January 6th. Instagram blocked teens from searching LGBTQ-related content for months. Now I'm going to read an article from Aaron in the Morning. As a outlet we've gone to for some of the kind of breaking news as far as kind of the ongoing oppression of trans folk in the U.S. This article is from Mira Lazine. Federal court rules in favor of forcibly detransitioning transgender inmates in Florida. In the final days of 2024, a federal judge in Florida's Northern District issued a ruling rejecting a preliminary injunction against a new Florida Department of Corrections policy targeting transgender inmates. This policy, introduced on September 30th, 2024, frames gender dysphoria as a short-term delusion, restricting access to gender-affirming care, permitting hormones only in rare instances deemed constitutionally necessary. The FTC bulletin also suggests psychotropic medications and psychotherapy as sufficient alternatives to medical transition, ignoring widely accepted medical guidelines. The ACLU, representing plaintiff Rain Keohane, challenged the policy, arguing it strips transgender inmates of essential care and dignity. Under the policy, trans women in Florida prisons are denied access to gender-aligned clothing and grooming standards, with confiscation of canteen items and head shaving mandated for non-compliance. According to the ACLU's October 2024 complaint, inmates face invasive examinations to assess breast size for bra eligibility, subjecting them to dehumanizing treatment under the guise of policy enforcement. The ACLU sought immediate relief, filing for a preliminary injunction to halt these measures. In his 23-page decision, Judge Alan Windsor, a Trump appointee with a record of anti-LGBTQ rulings, dismissed the injunction request. Windsor's opinion misgendered Keohane, describing her as a male who self-identifies as a woman. He argued that the FTC's policy does not constitute a blanket ban on hormone therapy, despite evidence showing the policy effectively forces the detransition of hundreds of inmates. Windsor claimed that Keohane, having navigated extensive bureaucratic hurdles to preserve her care, faced no imminent injury and therefore did not meet the criteria for emergency relief. Regarding social accommodations, Windsor acknowledged the harm but dismissed its significance, arguing that denying long hair and gender-appropriate clothing does not rise to the level of grossly incompetent care or an Eighth Amendment violation. Misrepresenting the World Professional Association for Transgender Health guidelines, Windsor claimed that social transition is not medically necessary and suggested psychotherapy as an adequate alternative. This echoes debunked conversion therapy approaches that lack scientific evidence that have been shown to increase risks of self-harm and suicide among transgender individuals. Windsor's reasoning reflects broader anti-transgender rhetoric, typically used in debates about transgender youth, but now increasingly applied to adults. The wait-and-see approach for minors, which relies on therapy to suppress gender dysphoria, has long been debunked as ineffective and harmful conversion therapy. Evidence consistently shows that medically necessary care for transgender individuals leads to overwhelmingly positive outcomes, with detransition rates remaining exceedingly low. Laws restricting transgender healthcare, by contrast, have been linked to significant increases in suicide attempts among transgender populations. Advocates warn that such policies represent the tip of the iceberg in escalating attacks on transgender rights. Restrictions on transgender youth healthcare have already expanded to include adults, with proposed bans in several states targeting individuals up to age 26. In the United Kingdom, healthcare providers face growing hostility, leading many to withdraw services under pressure. These global trends underscore a concerted effort to dismantle trans rights at every single level. In the US, Republicans have made transgender people a central focus, advancing policies to restrict anti discrimination protections in schools, sports, and the military. With the recent passage of the first anti LGBTQ plus federal law in 30 years, restricting military healthcare coverage for transgender dependents, attacks are reaching levels unseen in decades. House Speaker Mike Johnson has pledged to combat social justice in federal institutions, doubling down on these efforts under the guise of common sense. You know what's real common sense? Let people, let people, live and let live. Let people do what they want. Transgender people are not going to hurt you, etc. I think that's the common sense I would like to adhere to. Anyway, that's it for the live portion of today's show. I want to thank y'all for listening. Again, you can find us online at YouTube, Facebook, and the Media Cyphers podcast. You can listen to our show at your leisure at any podcasting app. Thank you again for listening, and everybody out there, keep on fighting for that revolution solution.